Somerset Maugham was not merely a global literary titan. He was a prime asset for British intelligence, deployed directly into the vortex of the Russian Revolution to salvage an empire. Yet, the most bitter paradox lies here. Maugham risked his life to defend a government fully prepared to imprison and publicly ruin him at a moment's notice, simply because of his true nature, a homosexual man. By 1917, the survival of Britain and France depended entirely on keeping the collapsing Russian Empire in the war. If Russia signed a separate peace, the German High Command would immediately load hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened Eastern Front troops onto trains and hurl them against the exhausted Allied lines in the West. Yet Russia was disintegrating. The Romanov dynasty had fallen, and a fragile provisional government shared street-level power with radical councils. Britain's foreign policy was reduced to a single, desperate objective: keep the Russian war machine functioning, no matter the internal political cost. Into this volatile, freezing vacuum of authority, British intelligence did not send a decorated general or a career diplomat. They sent Somerset Maugham. He was not dispatched as a savior to single-handedly rescue a falling nation, nor was he an action-oriented agent tasked with sabotage. His mandate was far more complex and grounded in the cold realities of statecraft. His role was to map a disintegrating society. British intelligence required an operator who could infiltrate the shifting political landscape, cultivate relationships across hostile factions, and identify exactly which forces possessed the will and the capability to keep Russia in the war. They needed raw, unfiltered data on the shifting allegiances of the provisional government, the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, and the remnants of the Tsarist elite. Maugham's value lay in his capacity to evaluate human capital, to listen to desperate men and determine who was lying, who was delusional, and who held genuine power. He was deployed because Britain recognized that surviving the crisis required an operative who understood the architecture of human deception. The foundation for this specific set of skills was laid decades before the war, far from the freezing streets of Petrograd. Maugham was born in 1874 in Paris, operating from childhood at the intersection of British identity and European culture. Growing up in the diplomatic and upper-middle-class circles of the French capital, he absorbed the nuances of foreign languages, cultural friction, and the fluid movement across borders. He became naturally accustomed to the transient lives of diplomats and expatriates, learning early how to observe a room without becoming its center. He was a perennial outsider, a position that forces a heightened awareness of social dynamics and hidden motives. This analytical detachment was violently sharpened when he returned to London to study medicine at St. Thomas's Hospital. Medical training in the late 19th century was a brutal, visceral education in the physical and psychological realities of the human condition. It was here that Maugham acquired the fundamental disciplines of an intelligence officer. A physician is trained to observe relentlessly. They learn to ask precise, probing questions and, critically, to differentiate between the narrative the patient constructs and the hard, undeniable physical symptoms presenting before them. Maugham learned to identify where people lied to themselves and to others out of fear, vanity, or desperation. He learned to memorize minute details, to catalog human suffering without emotional collapse, and most importantly, to hold vast amounts of private, damaging information in absolute confidence. He spent his days in the slums of Lambeth, delivering babies, tending to the dying, and witnessing the raw mechanics of survival. When he transitioned from medicine to literature, he did not abandon these skills. He commercialized them. His massive success as a writer provided the ultimate operational cover. A military officer asking questions in a neutral capital immediately triggers defensive countermeasures. A renowned author doing the same is merely seeking inspiration. His profession demanded international travel. It was entirely natural for Maugham to occupy expensive hotels in Geneva, Paris, or Petrograd, to write endless letters, and to move seamlessly through high society, intellectual circles, and the political elite. He possessed a legitimate, unquestionable reason to be curious. He could engage a politician, a dissident, or a socialite in prolonged conversation, ask deeply personal or politically sensitive questions, and extract vital intelligence under the guise of character research. British intelligence recognized that the modern war required a new type of asset. They did not just need men who could decode ciphers or memorize troop movements. They needed a man who could sit across a table, let his subject speak, and accurately decode the psychological truths hidden beneath the rhetoric. They needed a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of observation. This mastery of observation was not merely a professional tool cultivated for literature or medicine. It was a rigid mechanism for personal survival. Long before he was recruited to protect the secrets of the British Empire, Maugham was forced to protect his own. The modern biographical consensus frequently labels him as a man who maintained relationships with both men and women, culminating in a high-profile marriage and fatherhood. Yet, the most profound, defining romantic relationships of his adult life were with other men. In the social and legal architecture of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain, this was not a matter of private preference. It was a severe criminal liability. The state possessed the authority and the explicit willingness to destroy individuals over their private lives. The catastrophic fall of Oscar Wilde at the end of the 19th century served as a brutal, unforgettable public execution of a reputation. The trials demonstrated to the entire British establishment exactly what awaited those who strayed from the rigid moral orthodoxies of the era: public humiliation, physical imprisonment, the immediate eradication of a career, and total social exile. For a man of Maugham's rising status, the Wilde trials were a terrifying education in the mechanics of state power and social hypocrisy. He learned that visibility equated to vulnerability. To survive and to thrive within the highest echelons of a society that would eagerly imprison him, Maugham engineered a life of absolute compartmentalization. He constructed a formidable boundary between his public persona, the celebrated playwright and author, and his private emotional reality. He operated in plain sight while maintaining a deeply concealed inner world. There is no historical basis to suggest that his homosexuality is what drove him into the arms of British intelligence. However, the psychological infrastructure required to navigate such a divided existence perfectly mirrored the demands of espionage. Years before he received his first official intelligence briefing, Maugham was already an expert in the operational security of the self. He knew how to manage layered identities, how to converse without revealing his core, and how to exist in a constant state of quiet vigilance. He understood implicitly that information must be strictly controlled, that silence is often a weapon, and that a single misplaced trust could result in total ruin. When the First World War detonated across Europe in the summer of 1914, Maugham did not immediately transition into the shadows of intelligence work. The machinery of the British state was initially chaotic, scrambling to adapt to an industrial slaughter of unprecedented scale. Maugham, driven by a pragmatic sense of duty, volunteered for ambulance work with the Red Cross in France. This phase of his life was crucial because it violently stripped away any theoretical or romanticized notions of conflict. It dragged him out of the refined literary salons of London and thrust him directly into the mechanical, blood-soaked realities of modern warfare. He drove ambulances through the mud of Flanders, confronting shattered bodies, the overwhelming stench of gangrene, and the sheer logistical nightmare of the Western Front. He witnessed firsthand the incompetence of military bureaucracies, the stoicism of dying men, and the vast, unfeeling apparatus of state violence. He saw the war not as a grand geopolitical chessboard, but as a factory of human destruction. This exposure grounded his perspective. It ensured that when he later analyzed troop movements or assessed political stability, he understood the exact human cost of every failure and every miscalculation. As the conflict devolved into a grueling war of attrition, the British government realized that military force alone was insufficient. They required an aggressive expansion of their intelligence networks across the continent. The neutral nations of Europe suddenly became the most critical battlegrounds of the war. They needed operatives who could move freely across borders without projecting the rigid, unmistakable bearing of a British military officer. Maugham was an obvious asset. He possessed a legitimate civilian profession, fluency in French and German, and an existing international network. He was quietly recruited by John Wallinger, the head of the intelligence service operating in France and Switzerland, and transitioned from the blood-stifled mud of the ambulance corps into the invisible war. His primary operational theater was Switzerland. On paper, the country was neutral territory. In reality, cities like Geneva and Bern were the nerve centers of European espionage, serving as crowded, paranoid crossroads for British, French, and German agents, exiled revolutionaries, desperate diplomats, opportunistic businessmen, and ruthless information brokers. It was a suffocating ecosystem of paranoia and betrayal. The work Maugham executed here bore absolutely no resemblance to the dramatized fictions of armed confrontations or daring midnight raids. Real intelligence work was far more grueling, deeply psychological, and fundamentally bureaucratic. Maugham's daily existence involved a relentless cycle of meetings, evaluations, and reports. He operated under the cover of a writer researching a new play, holding court in expensive hotel lobbies and quiet cafes. His task was to cultivate sources, pay informants, and map the sprawling networks of enemy activity. He had to determine who was funneling German money into French pacifist movements, monitor the transit of strategic materials across neutral borders, and identify which officials were vulnerable to bribery or blackmail. The most dangerous challenge was not the threat of assassination, but the pervasive threat of deception. A single source sitting across from him over a cup of coffee could be a genuine patriot risking his life to sell accurate German troop schedules, a mercenary inflating rumors for cash, or a German counterintelligence plant deliberately feeding Maugham disinformation to blind the British High Command. Maugham's survival and the value of his intelligence depended entirely on his ability to read the person rather than just the information. He had to constantly weigh the reliability of his assets, looking for the physical tells, the inconsistencies in the narrative, and the underlying motives driving the betrayal. He applied the same diagnostic rigor he had learned in the medical wards of London, and the same psychological penetration that defined his writing. He waited. He verified. He managed an intricate web of compromised individuals, knowing that a miscalculation on his part would not result in his own death, but in the deaths of thousands of men trapped in the trenches hundreds of miles away. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply cynical process of extracting the truth from a world entirely dedicated to lying. The claustrophobic intelligence operations in Switzerland proved to be merely a training ground for a far more desperate assignment. By the summer of 1917, the British government faced a strategic catastrophe on the Eastern Front that threatened to lose them the war. The Russian Empire was collapsing. The sheer scale of the crisis dwarfed the localized espionage battles of Geneva. Germany was fighting a grueling two-front war, divided between the Allied forces in the west and the massive, though poorly equipped, Russian army in the east. British and French military planners knew the exact, terrifying mathematics of the situation. If Russia withdrew from the conflict, the German High Command would immediately transfer hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops to the Western Front. The Allied lines, already stretched to their absolute breaking point, would shatter under the massive influx of German divisions. Keeping Russia bleeding in the war was not a matter of foreign policy. It was the fundamental requirement for British survival. The political reality in Petrograd, however, was fundamentally incompatible with Allied demands. The Romanov dynasty had been annihilated in the February Revolution. In its place stood the Provisional Government, a fragile, deeply compromised coalition attempting to hold the remnants of a shattered nation together. They possessed the formal titles of state power, but they lacked a monopoly on violence and authority. The actual control of the streets, the factories, and the military garrisons was heavily fractured, shared uneasily with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers, and radicalized soldiers. The Russian people were entirely consumed by exhaustion. The war had cost them millions of casualties. The logistical infrastructure of the country had completely disintegrated, leading to severe food shortages, hyperinflation, and a civilian population pushed to the brink of mass starvation. Soldiers at the front were deserting by the thousands, shooting their officers, and walking home. The British government, operating out of a combination of arrogance and desperation, believed this terminal domestic collapse could be managed through targeted intelligence operations and massive financial intervention. They needed an operative to enter Petrograd, assess the fractured political landscape, bypass the rigid diplomatic channels, and establish direct contact with the factions that could keep the Russian war machine functional. In August 1917, they selected Maugham for this mission. He was dispatched to Russia not as a conventional spy, but as a high-level political operative and intelligence evaluator, armed with a staggering budget provided in part by American intelligence allies. His objective was explicit: funnel money to pro-war factions, support the provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, counter German propaganda, and prevent the Bolsheviks from seizing power and signing a separate peace treaty with Germany. Maugham arrived in a freezing, paranoid Petrograd in early September 1917. The city was a powder keg of striking workers, mutinous soldiers, and terrified aristocrats waiting for the inevitable slaughter. He operated under his standard, highly effective cover as a traveling writer, utilizing his international reputation to secure meetings with the most powerful and dangerous men in the capital. He did not engage in covert sabotage. His battlefield was the drawing rooms, political offices, and hotel suites of Petrograd. He met with ministers, Menshevik leaders, journalists, and foreign diplomats. He analyzed the political currents with the same cold, clinical precision he applied to a medical diagnosis. He applied his lifetime of observing human deception to the leaders of the Russian state. What Maugham found in Petrograd was a government operating in a state of terminal delusion. Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, was hailed by the Allies as the democratic savior of Russia. Maugham secured private meetings with Kerensky and evaluated him directly. His assessment was brutal and stripped of all diplomatic polite fiction. Maugham saw a man exhausted, physically ill, and entirely dependent on his own rhetoric. Kerensky could deliver soaring, impassioned speeches to hostile crowds, but he lacked the ruthless executive force required to govern a nation in a state of total anarchy. The provisional government was committing a fatal political error. They were honoring their treaty obligations to Britain and France by demanding that the Russian army continue to fight a war the Russian people absolutely despised. Against this fragile government stood the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Maugham analyzed the Bolshevik strategy and recognized its terrifying effectiveness. The provisional government offered the Russian people complex arguments about international treaties, democratic duty, and delayed reforms. The Bolsheviks offered a ruthless, brilliantly simplistic message that directly answered the immediate physical suffering of the population: peace, land, and bread. They promised an immediate end to the slaughter at the front, the redistribution of land to the peasants, and food for the starving cities. In a country completely devoid of resources and hope, ideological nuance is useless. The Bolsheviks understood that the people did not care about the geopolitical balance of Europe. They wanted to stop dying. Maugham quickly realized the absolute futility of his mission. British intelligence wanted him to prop up the provisional government and engineer a pro-Allied political consensus. Maugham's reports back to London reflected a starkly different reality. He informed his superiors that the situation was unsalvageable. You cannot purchase political legitimacy with foreign currency, and you cannot force a starving, mutinous army to fight by bribing newspaper editors to print pro-war propaganda. The structural collapse of the Russian state was too profound to be reversed by espionage. The British policy in Russia was fundamentally misaligned with the historical forces tearing the country apart. Britain required Russia to fight. The Russian people required the war to end. No amount of intelligence gathering or covert funding could reconcile that absolute contradiction. Maugham operated in an environment where every decision carried immense historical weight, yet he was utterly powerless to alter the trajectory of the revolution. He spent his days gathering intelligence, managing sources, and attempting to stitch together a coalition of moderate socialists who might oppose Lenin. He established a network of informants and funneled reports through secure diplomatic pouches. He watched the streets of Petrograd descend further into chaos, observing the complete paralysis of state authority. He was a master at reading the psychology of the individuals in front of him, but in Russia, he was forced to witness the psychology of a mass societal collapse. In late October, Maugham contracted tuberculosis. His lungs, already weakened, began to fail under the strain of the freezing Russian winter and the relentless pressure of his assignment. The physical deterioration mirrored the collapse of the government he was sent to protect. On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks executed a swift, heavily armed takeover of Petrograd. The provisional government evaporated. Kerensky fled. The state apparatus was seized by Lenin's forces, who immediately moved to fulfill their core promise, pulling Russia out of the First World War. The British intelligence operation in Petrograd was completely shattered. Maugham, severely ill and his mission totally compromised, was forced to evacuate, escaping on a British destroyer. He had failed to keep Russia in the war, but the failure was not a result of poor espionage. It was a failure of the British government to understand the absolute limits of their own power. Maugham delivered the exact intelligence they needed, but it was intelligence they were completely unwilling to accept. The withdrawal from Petrograd marked the end of Maugham's active deployment, but the geopolitical consequences of his reports materialized with devastating accuracy. In March 1918, the newly established Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers. Russia officially exited the First World War, ceding massive territories and population centers to German control. The nightmare scenario the British High Command had desperately tried to avert became the new reality. Germany immediately began transferring over 50 divisions from the Eastern Front to hurl against the Allied lines in France. Maugham's mission was classified as a failure by the metric of its original objective, yet this failure was not a product of poor tradecraft or individual incompetence. It was a brutal demonstration of the limits of covert intervention. The British Empire possessed global diplomatic networks, vast financial reserves, and highly capable operatives, but all of this infrastructure was useless against the crushing weight of a society undergoing total systemic collapse. Maugham provided British intelligence with a precise, unflinching diagnosis of a dying state. The failure lay not with the operative, but with a government that refused to accept that foreign intelligence cannot arrest the momentum of a domestic revolution. While Maugham navigated the collapse of nations and the strict demands of state secrecy, his private life required an equally rigorous regime of deception and strategic maneuvering. The central emotional anchor of his adult life was not forged in the drawing rooms of London, but in the muddy chaos of the Western Front. In 1914, while serving in the Red Cross ambulance unit in Flanders, Maugham met Gerald Haxton. Haxton was a young American, 22 years Maugham's junior, possessing a temperament entirely opposite to the reserved, analytical British author. Where Maugham was a silent, calculating observer, encumbered by a severe stammer and a natural inclination toward detachment, Haxton was aggressively charismatic. He was an extrovert, a heavy drinker, an effortless conversationalist, and a man who could walk into any bar, casino, or ship's lounge and immediately establish a network of acquaintances. Haxton became the most significant and enduring relationship of Maugham's life. He was not merely a romantic partner, he was an essential functional component of Maugham's existence and his writing process. When they traveled the globe together in the decades following the war, Haxton acted as Maugham's social proxy. The American's easy charm dissolved barriers, granting Maugham access to the raw, unvarnished stories of sailors, colonial administrators, expatriates, and drifters, the exact human material that populated his most famous fiction. Haxton would draw people out, and Maugham would sit quietly in the corner, listening, cataloging, and dissecting their motives. They operated as a complementary unit. Haxton absorbed the friction of the social world, allowing Maugham to maintain his necessary distance. There is a temptation to project the conventions of spy fiction onto their relationship, to position Haxton as a fellow covert operative assisting Maugham in his intelligence duties. The historical record completely rejects this. Haxton was deported from Britain in 1915 on charges of gross indecency and was formally banned from re-entering the country, an exile that forced Maugham to live primarily abroad for the rest of his life. Haxton was a liability to the British state, not an asset. Their relationship underscores the fundamental reality of Maugham's life. His primary allegiance and his most profound emotional connection existed entirely outside the boundaries of what his government deemed legal or acceptable. The complexity of Maugham's private world is further magnified by his relationship with Siri Wellcome. The narrative that Maugham married a woman simply to construct a convenient beard to mask his homosexuality is a severe historical oversimplification. Human sexuality and emotional attachments rarely adhere to rigid modern categorizations. Maugham had genuine romantic and sexual relationships with women, and his involvement with Siri, a prominent socialite and the wife of pharmaceutical magnate Henry Wellcome, was intense and consequential. They embarked on an affair that resulted in Siri's pregnancy. Following her bitter, highly publicized divorce from Wellcome, she and Maugham married in 1917, and he became a father to their daughter, Liza. For a period, Maugham attempted to inhabit the role of the conventional Edwardian husband and father. He maintained a household, engaged in the required social rituals of the London elite, and projected the image of a settled, respectable patriarch. This was not entirely a cynical performance. It was a genuine attempt to navigate a life that accommodated his affections for Siri and his responsibilities to his child. However, this domestic architecture could not suppress or erase his enduring bond with Gerald Haxton. Maugham found himself suspended between two irreconcilable realities. He was a married man tied to the rigid social structures of British high society, and simultaneously a man who required the companionship of an exiled American whom the British state had labeled a criminal. This two-tiered existence was heavily dictated by the lethal legal environment of the time. The necessity for absolute secrecy regarding his relationships with men was not born of mere privacy, it was a mandate of survival. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, any sexual act between men, even in strict privacy, was punishable by hard labor. The ghost of Oscar Wilde's destruction remained the defining lesson for Maugham's generation. A single accusation, a leaked letter, or a disgruntled associate could trigger a chain reaction resulting in a police investigation, a public trial, and total annihilation. For Maugham, the stakes were exponentially higher. He was not just a private citizen. He was one of the most famous, highly compensated authors in the world, and a former operative who held the secrets of the British state. The press would have consumed a scandal with feral intensity. His publisher would have dropped him, his books would have been removed from circulation, and his immense wealth would not have protected him from the physical reality of a prison cell. He constructed a life designed to mitigate this catastrophic risk. He compartmentalized his existence with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to an intelligence operation. In London, he was the distinguished author and husband. Abroad, traveling through Asia or the South Pacific with Haxton, he existed in a different paradigm. He controlled the flow of information about his own life with absolute precision. He knew which friends could be trusted with the truth, which acquaintances required a constructed narrative, and exactly how much distance to place between himself and the authorities. He lived in a state of permanent operational security. This intersection of state intelligence and a criminalized private life raises a profound historical question regarding vulnerability. In the mid-20th century, security services operated on the rigid doctrine that homosexual operatives were inherent security risks, easily compromised by foreign intelligence services threatening exposure. It is a compelling theoretical framework, but applying it blindly to Maugham requires evidence that does not exist. There is zero historical documentation to suggest that German intelligence blackmailed him in Switzerland or that the Bolsheviks compromised him in Petrograd, using his relationship with Haxton or anyone else as leverage. Maugham's loyalty to the British war effort was absolute, and his execution of his duties was uncompromising. The true historical value lies not in phantom blackmail plots, but in the paradox of the state itself. The British government criminalized the very behavior of the men they recruited to execute their most sensitive and vital operations. The vulnerability was not created by the operatives' desires, but by the laws of the nation they served. If a man can be destroyed by his own society for his private life, that private life automatically becomes a weapon that can be wielded against him. Maugham navigated this paradox daily. The British state demanded that he risk his life, his health, and his sanity to protect an empire that, had it known the full truth of his existence, would have eagerly stripped him of his freedom and his dignity. He served a master that was simultaneously his employer and his greatest threat. This necessity for constant, vigilant concealment did not evaporate with the end of the First World War, nor did it die with Gerald Haxton in 1944. The loss of Haxton was a profound psychological blow, plunging Maugham into a period of acute grief and destabilization. Yet, it did not mark the end of his emotional reliance on other men. Alan Searle, a younger man from a modest London background whom Maugham had first met in 1928, seamlessly stepped into the void left by Haxton. Searle possessed a fundamentally different constitution. Where Haxton was reckless, combative, and socially aggressive, Searle was mild-mannered, devoted, and fiercely protective of the aging author. For the final 2 decades of Maugham's life, Searle served as his secretary, his companion, and his primary emotional anchor. The enduring presence of Alan Searle forces a historical reckoning with Maugham's identity, systematically dismantling the narrative that his same-sex relationships were merely youthful indiscretions, situational anomalies, or symptoms of an eccentric artistic temperament. It establishes a lifelong, unbroken pattern. From his early years in London, through the geopolitical chaos of 2 world wars and into his final days on the French Riviera, Maugham's most vital domestic and romantic partnerships were with men. This reality coexisted alongside his marriage to Siri and his genuine affection for his daughter. Applying a rigid, retroactive label to his identity often flattens the historical truth. He possessed a deeply complex emotional architecture, one that accommodated both women and men, but ultimately required him to anchor his life around male companionship. The tragedy was not his sexuality. The tragedy was that the British legal system required him to treat his most enduring relationships as highly classified, actionable state secrets. Maugham utilized this lifetime of forced compartmentalization when he finally chose to document his experiences in the intelligence service. In 1928, he published a collection of interconnected short stories titled Ascendant, or The British Agent. The publication fundamentally and permanently altered the trajectory of espionage literature. Before Maugham, the spy novel was heavily saturated with jingoistic romance, dominated by aristocratic heroes executing daring physical feats, foiling exaggerated villains, and securing clean, unmitigated victories for the empire. The pre-war spy was a knight in modern clothing. Maugham took that entire literary framework and dismantled it piece by piece. Drawing directly from his operational files in Geneva and Petrograd, Maugham introduced the public to the actual grinding mechanics of intelligence work. The protagonist, Ascendant, is not a superhero. He is a cynical, emotionally detached writer recruited into a massive, unfeeling bureaucratic machine. The work depicted in the stories is overwhelmingly tedious. It consists of waiting in dreary hotel rooms, decoding intercepted telegrams, interviewing profoundly unreliable people, and managing the logistics of bribery. There are no dramatic gunfights. Instead, there is the slow, paralyzing realization that a human asset might be compromised, or the bureaucratic necessity of orchestrating the assassination of a man who might actually be innocent. Maugham stripped the intelligence profession of its moral clarity. In the universe of Ascendant, the British intelligence apparatus does not operate on a higher ethical plane than its enemies. It is a ruthless mechanism that consumes human lives, often ordinary, flawed individuals caught in the crossfire of great power conflicts, with absolute indifference. The primary adversaries are rarely enemy agents. They are the pervasive fog of war, the sheer incompetence of Allied officers, the unreliability of human memory, and the constant, suffocating boredom of surveillance. When Winston Churchill, who possessed an intimate understanding of the wartime intelligence apparatus, read a draft of the collection, he reportedly ordered Maugham to burn 14 of the stories. Churchill argued they violated the Official Secrets Act and revealed far too much about the actual methods of the Secret Service. Maugham, understanding the iron grip of the state, destroyed the manuscripts. The stories that survived and reached the public were still potent enough to lay the foundation for every realistic spy novelist who followed, directly influencing the cynical, morally gray landscapes of Graham Greene and John le Carré. The brilliance of Ascendant stems directly from the intersection of Maugham's dual lives. The mechanics of operating a covert intelligence network and the mechanics of sustaining a criminalized private life rely on the exact same psychological infrastructure. Maugham did not become a brilliant writer because he was a spy, nor did he become a spy because he lived a hidden life. Rather, the skills required to survive in all three domains, literature, espionage, and a prohibited private existence, are identical. In intelligence work, an operative must learn to fragment information. You never tell a single source the entire objective. You control the flow of data, ensuring that each contact possesses only the exact fragment of truth required to execute their specific task. You assess trust not by what a person says, but by observing the minute discrepancies between their stated motives and their physical actions. You build a public cover story that is plausible enough to withstand casual scrutiny, and you operate your actual mission entirely behind that facade. In his private life, operating under the constant threat of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, Maugham utilized these precise tactics every single day. He fragmented his social circles. His literary acquaintances in London saw one meticulously constructed version of the man. The expatriates in Paris saw another, and the men he loved saw a third. He constantly evaluated the trustworthiness of his peers, knowing that a single betrayal, a single rumor whispered to the wrong official, could trigger a police raid and total ruination. He maintained the highly visible, perfectly plausible cover of a married, successful playwright while running his actual emotional life in complete shadow. The operational record of Somerset Maugham during the First World War systematically dismantles the mythology surrounding British intelligence. The popular conception of espionage, heavily influenced by later cinematic portrayals, insists on a world populated exclusively by highly trained military officers utilizing advanced technology to execute precise kinetic operations. Maugham's deployment reveals a vastly different, far more pragmatic reality. When the British Empire found itself locked in an existential struggle, it did not rely solely on its military academies. It conscripted the civilian world. British intelligence built its wartime networks by weaponizing the everyday lives of writers, international businessmen, exiled aristocrats, and traveling diplomats. They recognized that a perfectly trained military officer often possessed the rigid, unmistakable bearing of the state he served, making him virtually useless in the fluid, paranoid environments of neutral Europe. A writer, however, inherently possessed the required camouflage. Maugham's story proves that the most valuable asset a nation could deploy was not a man who knew how to fire a weapon, but a man who possessed a massive, pre-existing social network and a legitimate reason to ask questions. This reliance on civilian networks highlights the supreme importance of neutral territories during global conflicts. The war was not exclusively decided in the trenches of the Somme or Verdun. It was heavily negotiated, betrayed, and manipulated in the hotel lobbies of Geneva and Bern. Switzerland was the silent front. It operated as a concentrated ecosystem of European power, a place where enemy combatants, peace activists, and opportunistic informants occupied the same dining rooms. In this environment, human intelligence, the raw, unverified testimonies of compromised individuals, was the only available technology. Maugham did not have access to wiretaps or satellite surveillance. His entire operational capacity depended on his ability to sit across from a human being, analyze their micro-expressions, evaluate their financial desperation, and determine if they were telling the truth. Espionage in this era was entirely dependent on the psychological acuity of the handler. Furthermore, Maugham's mission in Petrograd erases the artificial boundary between covert intelligence and formal diplomacy. He was sent to Russia as a spy, yet his daily activities involved direct negotiations with the heads of state, political lobbying, and the management of a massive budget intended to stabilize a foreign government. He was acting as an unacknowledged ambassador, carrying the immense weight of British foreign policy without any of its formal protections. He was tasked with an objective that far exceeded the gathering of secrets. He was ordered to alter the trajectory of a revolution. This leads directly to the most brutal and enduring lesson of Maugham's Russian deployment: the absolute limits of imperial power. By 1917, the British Empire possessed global military dominance, vast financial reserves, and a sprawling, highly effective diplomatic apparatus. The British High Command fundamentally believed that these tools could manage any crisis. They operated under the arrogant assumption that a well-funded intelligence network could manipulate the internal politics of a foreign nation and force it to act against its own survival instincts. They sent Maugham to buy the loyalty of the Russian state. The reality on the freezing streets of Petrograd shattered that imperial delusion. The crisis consuming Russia was not a localized political dispute that could be resolved with British sterling and pro-war propaganda. It was a structural, systemic collapse of an entire civilization. The Russian military apparatus was functionally dead, bled dry by years of industrial slaughter. The Romanov dynasty had obliterated its own legitimacy through decades of incompetence, and the provisional government that replaced it was entirely disconnected from the physical suffering of the populace. The Russian citizens were starving, freezing, and dying in a war they no longer understood. They demanded an immediate end to the conflict, a demand the Bolsheviks weaponized with lethal efficiency. No intelligence operative, regardless of their budget, their intellect, or their tradecraft, could arrest that historical momentum. Maugham possessed the analytical brilliance to perfectly diagnose the collapse of the Russian state. He saw clearly that the provisional government was a phantom entity and that the Bolsheviks held the true, violent power in the streets. He relayed this vital intelligence back to London, fulfilling his primary mandate. But diagnosis does not equal control. Identifying that a massive nation is in the final stages of societal death does not grant you the power to resurrect it. Maugham's failure in Russia was not a personal operational failure. It was a profound demonstration that foreign intelligence cannot solve a domestic social crisis. You cannot bribe a starving army to fight, and you cannot use espionage to replace the lost legitimacy of a broken government. Yet, as he maneuvered through the highest echelons of state power, managing the secrets of an empire and mapping the collapse of nations, he was forced to operate in complete shadow within his own borders. He dedicated his intellect and risked his physical survival for a British state that fundamentally categorized his most profound emotional relationships as severe criminal offenses. He was a man who understood every nuance of statecraft, yet the state he served demanded his absolute silence under the threat of total destruction. He was lauded globally for his brilliant, penetrating examinations of human nature, while his own nature remained a heavily guarded, strictly classified reality. We are left looking at a man who was simultaneously an instrument of imperial power and a target of its legal wrath. How does a man construct a life of such immense, enduring historical value while a sword hangs perpetually over his neck, placed there by the very nation he fought to protect?